American dream is dead. But if I get elected president, I will bring it back bigger and better and stronger than ever before, and we will make America great again. Thank you. Thank you very much.
2016, year of the snake. It's time for a change in the White House, y'all. Bring it.
How's it going, folks? Good to see y'all. Click the share button. Please let folks know we are live. No, you remember this, buddies? Remember our flattening the curve chart? Remember that? What happened? What happened? We're going to talk about it. We've got some exciting conversation tonight, you guys. So tune in, click share, let folks know we're live. When I say true,
Socialist Sanders and freaking Flanders, Army Rangers and the Navy SEALs, all staying strong with the art of the deal. If you like your eyes, if you love your love, there's one choice, the only one. When I say Trump, you say hell high. When I say Trump, you say hell high.
Make America great again.
Make America great again. Make America great again. Time to make America great Are you a real patriot of the USA?
Hello, Janet. How's it going? Good to see you.
What about the ability to work a job? Have jobs available to work? You know who we need? This thing starts with a T.
I know exactly who we need. And we need 4 more years, my friends. 4 more years. 2 times. 2 states. Do it. Deal with it. Make America. How's it going, Karen? There's my Monkin. Hey, Janice, how's it going? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. You are watching the one and only Trump Talk US live in DC with Suzzanne Monk. I am Suzzanne Monk. We are in DC. We are live in DC in beautiful, historic Anacostia, 8 minutes away from the nation's capital. We're 15 minutes away from the president's White House. 14 minutes if the traffic is good. So we're right here. We're right here in the swamp where everything happens, where everything's swampy. And we're here day after day talking about what these crazies are doing to our country. So, of course, we have Chris McDonald representing Trump Talk US in the room. He's going to be greeting patriots and sharing links and all of the good stuff that we need him to do. There's Valerie, Nancy. Good to see you guys. Welcome, welcome. We are going to have Tim Rush on tonight. We've talked to Tim Rush many times from the LaRouche organization. As you know, they were very, very useful. They were very, very useful. That's Tim right now. He's making sure he's getting the right information. He'll be calling in just a few minutes. The LaRouchians were very useful when we started talking about the collusion, when we started talking about the British involvement in the Christopher Steele dossier, all of this coup, this global coup. Thank you, Lisa. Good to see you. That we've been talking about again and again. Yeah, Lisa, no one is here. I'm going to put this up so people understand what I'm saying. Lisa said she missed me and she's not getting notifications. You're right. I was in Facebook jail for a month because I shared an article from the New York Post about hydroxychloroquine. So the same thing, actually, they're starting to push back against President Trump. They want to shut down his Twitter account because he has talked about the hypocrisy of headlines with regards to hydroxychloroquine. And so it's very similar, that same pressure. The social media giants do not like us. They do not like the truth. They do not like anything that shuts down their narrative about. We've been talking, as I said, we're going to be talking with Tim Rush. We've been talking about things with him in the past in regard to this coup. You and I both know that this shutdown is yet another aspect of this globalization, of this coup against the president of the United States, but also in a push to globalize our country, to install more and more global control over U.S. citizens. And they are attempting, of course, to use the World Health Organization, the CDC, etc., to push that agenda. Now, here's what's great. The president has been seeing through these lies, and we have in the last week removed ourselves from the World Health Organization. We are no longer funding or participating in the World Health Organization. Thank you, President Trump. So important we get out of this organization that is literally a linchpin part of this coup to try to bring down the United States and to establish global communism around the world. They've been literally involved in it from the beginning. Thrilled to see that we are actually now pushing back on the CDC's falsification of data. The president has issued an order that will now require hospitals, rather than delivering that data through the CDC, they will be delivering that data to the White House administration directly, to the Health and Human Services Department. We are going to be dealing with direct data, getting it out of the purveyance of the CDC. So exactly what Valerie is saying, no more CDC BS. Oh, I see. Listen, sorry. Chris says he can't do links because Firefox won't do the links anymore. I understand. They're messing with us. So, yes, hospitals will now report directly to Washington, directly to the Health and Human Services, directly to the administration, directly to the president's cabinet people. So, Surgeon General, of course, Health and Human Services. These are departments that are in the government. Okay, they have a cabinet member. Okay, the CDC is not that. The CDC is an advisory organization that certainly is not part of the government or the administration. So glad to see the president is moving them out. In fact, he went so far as to suggest that if hospitals need help collecting the data, that we can get the National Guard in to assist in data collection, which, people are like, that seems way overreach. Why would we need the National Guard to collect numbers? It is a statement, not even meant for necessarily, it's not a statement that's saying, oh, well, if you need help, we can send the National Guard. It's a statement of strength. It's a statement saying, if you cannot get those numbers correct, if you cannot send us accurate numbers, if you're going to continue to send these bad numbers, we'll make sure an agent of the federal government is collecting that information for you. So, the president isn't playing with these games, these globalist games. So, of course, the trolls are going to say this, and this is what I love about the trolls. The trolls don't care that the CDC manipulates the data. They don't care about that. They just care that the president might manipulate the data. So what I find really ridiculous is literally the trolls are the CDC is already manipulating and doing so very publicly, claiming deaths that are not COVID deaths, they're actually COVID deaths, counting multiple tests again and again as on the same person as multiple tests. We've seen the numbers, and we've seen the reason hospitals are getting paid a reasonable amount of money, significant funds in stimulus. Stimulus isn't the word. They used a different word for the hospital rescue funds, basically, for hospitals that were dealing with a lot of COVID patients. So if you had a COVID patient, if you had people who tested positive for COVID, you were getting funds. So from the government. We wonder why the hospitals were cooking the books and making the numbers look bigger. But that's going to be all solved, regardless of what the little trolls want, regardless of the hypocrisy of the trolls. To suggest, oh, well, it's all right to cook the books if you're cooking them in our favor, but certainly we don't want anybody able to manipulate the data if they don't agree with us. It's just your motivations are so entirely thin and obvious. I mean, it's like you're wearing a pantyhose mask. It's so obvious what the reality of your motivations are. And that's to oppose the president. You have no interest in the country. You have no interest in people's health. You have no interest in well-being. For any of those things, you'll excuse me. We're getting ready for Tim to call in, and that's the music that plays when I plug in the phone there. So the hypocrisy is ridiculous, and we're seeing the hypocrisy in this additional round of shutdowns yet again. We see states like California, here in D.C., Muriel Bowser has said that she will extend the emergency order through October, which is far beyond her legal capacity to extend the order, where, of course, the only remedy is to then take legal action. We're in the process now where we have to sue a lot of these people. We have to sue the government. We have to sue the mayor because they are violating the law. They are violating their authority, and they are taking more authority than necessary, and to a devastating result for the economy, As we know, we've seen millions of people put out of work. We've seen thousands of businesses lose their ability, close their doors permanently. We see businesses struggling across the country. We're all going back into shutdown town again. Those businesses that just barely opened up, just barely were able to get enough workers to come back in, are struggling to keep a customer base enough to even pay those workers, to even keep the doors open. Now we're going to have to endure another round of shutdowns. Why? Why are we doing that? Now, Tim is going to be calling in, I reckon, in about 4 or 5 minutes. And these are some of the questions that we are going to be asking him. So, some really interesting questions. We have some real things to talk about, and how that plays into the bigger picture, how that plays into what's going on globally, what's going on with the foreign policy, what's going on with the Federal Reserve. There's some really big questions on those aspects of the economic fallout, the economic reasoning behind this shutdown activity. Certainly, there's a whole lot of information that we'll be able to discuss with Tim when he comes in. So I'm excited to have that. I'm excited to have someone who has been dealing with this issue and certainly can put it into construct, because we're going to need to fix this economy. I mean, the damage that is being done to this economy is humongous. The damage being done to this economy is potentially generational. And so certainly we are going to need, a really bold plan to restore the economy, to get the country back on track, to get people back to their jobs, to get businesses back operating, to get all of our industries back competing effectively again, with not just our global partners, but certainly, here's Tim. Let's bring him in. Hello, Tim. How are you?
I'm fine, Suzzanne. How are you?
Good, good. Let me see if I can get you plugged into the stereo speakers here. So give me just a second.
Terrific. Take all the time you need.
Okay. Let me see. Say something there, Tim.
Okay, sure.
Hi, great, great.
Okay.
We've got you through the big speakers. All of that's going very well. Tim, welcome to the show. I appreciate you being on the show. Everyone loves when you come on the show. We have great conversations, and it's usually a bunch of stuff we actually have to research afterwards for, several hours, sometimes days afterwards, just to keep up and try to put our heads around all of the information that you're giving us. And I'm glad you're here now, because there's been a lot of things going on. We see the economy has started to come back, but then we see the re-shutdowns happening. The Roger Stone situation is very interesting, and I'm actually very curious because Tim had mentioned to me earlier that there's some relevance to Roger Stone's sentence being commuted in regards to the global cabal, the as we know, the Christopher Steeles, the British coup against this president, this British-led coup against this president. So I'm excited to have you explain some of that, but certainly welcome, and I want to have everyone. This is Tim Rush. Welcome, Tim, to the show.
Well, thanks very much, Suzzanne. It's always a delight for me to be with you folks and with you. Let me start, and then please just interject anything that's on your mind.
Sure.
I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Are you getting that also?
No, you're fine. If you can deal with the feedback, you sound great.
No problem at all. Great.
Great.
So the Stone situation leads to something extremely important, because the president over the weekend tweeted that he would like to extradite Christopher Steele from Britain to face charges in the United States in light of, among other things, the British court ruling that something that was in the so-called Steele dossier involving a couple of Russian bankers had been completely concocted, was defamatory, and he awarded the bankers in Russia something like 150,000 pounds each. Mm-hmm. The amount of money is less important than the finding.
Sure.
And the president very correctly jumped on this and said this is proof that the whole dossier was a crock. Mm-hmm. But this is what he was saying, which is very, very important, is you can't lightly say, oh, gee, it was a crock. Right. These are criminal matters of trying to bring down a U.S. presidency and a U.S. president on behalf of a foreign power. Because this is MI6 when you're talking about Christopher Steele. This is the heart of not the British people, but the British, the sort of legacy of the British Empire at work.
Certainly.
So he put a motion on the table, in effect. The president did. Let's bring this guy back. Let's have him face charges.
Right.
And it's really important that we in the United States second the president's motion.
Yes. I agree. We've been asking for some justice on this for a little while.
Exactly. And I didn't think I would get any objections from you, Suzzanne. But the reason this is very important is that the president's action in commuting Steele is of a piece with this, just as the action of Barr and the people around him on making sure that the travesty of the Flynn case was overturned. Yeah. Even though there's still action by that that judge to try to somehow drag this thing out into some final, full court.
No, it's literally, that judge is literally behaving like the child in the grocery store. The mom has already put the candy bar back, and yet we're still screaming we'll have to be dragged out of the store. That's how much of a tantrum we're seeing.
You bet it. Now, the reason Stone is very interesting is that Stone's association with Trump goes back, as many people know, to the 1980s. Mm-hmm. But Stone was working very closely with Reagan in Reagan's bid in 79 to 80. And Stone addressed a LaRouche movement meeting at the beginning of September 2018. Okay. And he's been in touch with our movement for some time. He's very respectful of what we do, of what he does, and so forth. I just wanted to read the very beginning of it because I think it really sets the stage. He said, "Thank you very much. First of all, I guess I should say that I'm delighted that this worked out logistically so that I was able to join you. I think it's very important to say at the top that the work that the International Schiller Institute, which is kind of the international arm of the Lyndon LaRouche movement, the Schiller Institute is doing for both peace and prosperity around the world is very important work. I first became acquainted with Dr. Lyndon LaRouche. that was a nice honorific, but Lyndon
Right.
LaRouche didn't have a doctorate.
Right.
Dr. Lyndon LaRouche, back in 1979, when he was a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president, and played a very important backstage role in the election of our last outsider president before Trump, Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a very interesting story because we loosed a tremendous assault on George H.W. Bush,
Right.
who was the leading primary opponent of Reagan,
Right.
around the fact that that Bush was a member of the Trilateral Commission and in tight with the whole Rockefeller globalist apparatus.
Sure.
Today, people don't know that much, or we don't talk much about the Trilateral Commission, but at that time, we introduced it in a particularly effective way,
Mm-hmm.
and that took the sails out of Bush's campaign.
Sure. Yes.
But there's also, and I know that we've mentioned this before on your show, Suzzanne, but it's worth remembering, that LaRouche was seated next to Reagan at a very important debate. I believe it was sponsored by the NRA.
Mm-hmm.
And at a certain point, Reagan leaned over to LaRouche and said, look, Lyndon, if I get elected, what policy area would you recommend I look at that is not currently part of what's in our program?
Right.
And LaRouche said, look at the issue of directed beam weapons, things like lasers, particle beams, and so forth, harnessed to the task of destroying incoming ICBMs, missiles,
Sure.
so that we can eliminate the danger of nuclear war on
Sure.
this planet.
Right. Right.
And the president sort of filed that away in his mind,
Mhm.
Reagan did.
Mhm.
When he became president, and in the interim between his election and when he took the oath of office,
Mhm.
he activated a certain group of people in the National Security Council to contact LaRouche, bring him in, and over 2.5 years of discussions, it yielded the Strategic Defense Initiative.
Right.
Which have hallmarks of LaRouche's particular form of statecraft embedded in it that was really long-lasting and needs to be revived today. I mention this to you simply because Stone sort of was there at the beginning.
Right. Right.
And what he did on the Hannity show the other night, when he was interviewed on Fox, when he after the commutation of his sentence,
Mhm.
was really striking. Not something that Fox itself particularly publicized, and certainly didn't get publicized in the rest of the media.
Right.
But what he said was, and I'll just quote him on this. He said he was talking about the issue of Russian collusion. And he said, yeah, I had a Twitter direct message with this Lucifer 2.0 persona,
Right.
but it was after the WikiLeaks had published all the material.
Yep.
And he said, that goes out the window, and he throws out something. And then he says, thirdly, we don't even know that Lucifer 2.0 is a Russian agent.
Correct.
Just because John Brennan says something's true,
Right.
he said the steel dossier was real too.
Correct.
I
And
could have proved it-
Gucci, from my understanding of social media, Gucci himself has said he has no affiliation with the Russian government and finds that laughable, actually, that he's
in
been
addition,
associated with them.
Right. And what Bill Binney, who was the former technical director of the NSA, and I know you interviewed him, Suzzanne, and
Mhm.
we've worked with him a great deal. Bill Binney showed that this was a thumb drive, most likely taken down by an insider, not a hack at all. And he says that it's more likely not the Lucifer 2 is probably simply a cover for a whole program called Marble something or other. I can't
Right.
remember the full name of it.
Okay.
That the NSA had developed or the CIA had developed, which allows them to implant when they're rifling through computer files,
Right.
little breadcrumbs to try to divert people into a false attribution of who did it.
Yeah, as if you were putting somebody else's fingerprints on the stolen goods, so to speak.
Exactly. Perfect example. So this is what he went on to say. This is a Stone interview by Hannity. So I could have proved his trial, using forensic evidence and expert testimony from fellows like Bill Binney, former NSA counterintelligence expert, and Ray McGovern, that no one hacked the DNC, that there was no online hack at all, that the information based on the download times was downloaded to a portable disk and taken out the back door.
Sure.
But I wasn't allowed to present that defense because Judge Jackson would not allow it.
Right.
Now, add to this what came out about 2 months ago. Barr insisted on its release, which were some of the House Intelligence Select Commission on Intelligence hearings. I believe it was at the end of 2017, where Sean Henry, I think is his last name, Sean Henry, who was head of the CrowdStrike group, which was hired by the DNC to supposedly do forensics on their computers. They had announced that it was the Russian hack. He said in sworn testimony, and this has been known by all the principals for 2.5 years, that in fact they had no such evidence.
Right.
Now, I bring this up at the outset because there's we've got to really blow apart the whole basis on which the Russiagate thing was orchestrated, particularly by the Steele circles, by British intelligence, by the whole London-centered group.
Right.
Because that is our best sight line for being able to free the president up to take some bold actions, both in economics and in foreign policy, between now and the election, to be able to turn the tables on this smug, sick Democratic Party playbook, which is to hang the coronavirus problems around the president's neck and to work with their insiders in Wall Street and elsewhere, for certainly the Silicon Valley crowd, to pull the plug on enough of the stock market in October, since it's the only reason it has this crazy surge right now is because the Federal Reserve is pouring in money like there's no tomorrow. They could easily tamper with that. And it's very useful to keep in mind. I think I mentioned this to you about a year ago, Suzzanne, that it had to have been a year ago. In the August 2019 annual summit of central bankers in Jackson Hole, middle of August, late August every year. Last year, it was a full court press from the BlackRock group, working with a whole bunch of former central bankers on their board of directors, together with the head of the Bank of England at the time, Mark Carney. They were talking about the fact that we have to have currencies directly issued by consortium of central banks through a fiat or cryptocurrency, take fiscal decisions, which means your budget decisions, out of the hands of sovereign governments. He called it a financial regime change. At that same time, Bill Dudley, I called him Deadly, Bill Deadly, who was the former head of the New York Federal Reserve, and the New York Federal Reserve is the Federal Reserve. Everything else is window dressing. So the New York Federal Reserve, the head of it, Deadly, who had just left around 2018, came out and said, look, we have to prevent Trump from getting reelected. It is a no-no for central bankers to wander into political declarations, but we're in such an extreme situation that in terms of our globalist financial operations, we have to enter this in our own names and say we're going to sink that reelection. So people should just take it for granted that this is what they have in store, right? So the reason I wanted to start with Stone, with Binney, with his long association with LaRouche movement and so forth, is that in that same statement that Stone made to our Schiller Institute, this was September of 2018, he said something very, very interesting toward the beginning. He said, I have great admiration for Helga Zepp LaRouche, who is with you today. She's LaRouche's widow, and she's been carrying on. He said, I think these people are doing an extraordinary job to try to forge greater understanding of the international issues that would bring my country, the United States, and Russia, China, and virtually every country on the globe into some kind of harmony so that we can live in both peace and prosperity. I salute you for being there today and participating in this conference. And then he goes into his work with Trump over these many years. So we'll get back to that, but I wanted to really emphasize.
Well, Jim, I think it's interesting that we're talking about what's going on as far as the Fed is concerned. You know, people are starting to ask some questions. Certainly, as we're seeing the re-shutdown start to happen. You know, California shutting back down, DC extending their shutdown dates through October. You know, we've seen the president over the last week, he's pulled us out of funding for the WHO. He has taken the CDC out of the loop as far as data collection is concerned. So we're starting to see a lot of things indicated that the president is, one, very aware of what has been going on globally not just in regards to the Christopher Steele dossier coup, but how that coup has actually expanded and continued. And I think the shutdowns being the pandemic, if you will, and how that the shutdowns have been operated throughout the globe, and certainly how they're being operated here in the United States and pushed by the Democrat Party, which makes it very obvious where that agenda is coming from. We're starting to see the president take some bold actions. You know, it's interesting that you said that he's starting to actually make moves that I think many of us in the early shutdown days were begging for, and now we're seeing those things happen. So I feel like there might be something economically that's changed. So maybe a dam that's broke, that we don't understand, that the president is now more freed to do things. So what do you think might be giving the president that renewed sense of power and of authority to start actually going after this coup in a more direct way?
I think let me put it this way to you. You have to go on the offensive. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's necessarily that something has released, but there's an accumulation. He's been leading a counter coup, which is what we're discussing, right? He's been leading the counter coup. It's got the fact that he jumped on this question of Steele being convicted in a British court for defamation of these Russian bankers.
Right.
This British thing is very interesting because at its core, it is just so rotten from the crown down to the secret intelligence services, and obviously the City of London is the real brain of globalization. Mm-hmm. Its arms include Wall Street, but the real source of these policies and the tradition of globalist or just looting on the scale that we're talking about is really intrinsic to the British Empire. But there's another Britain. And what you and I were talking about this earlier last week, actually, Suzzanne.
Right.
Very, very interesting initiative coming from Boris Johnson.
Yes.
Which has been way, way underplayed. And it raises certain questions. And I know you raised some questions with me on this, and other people I've spoken to have raised it. But he said something very striking. This was about 2 weeks ago. He said, look, we're economically prostrate here in Britain. Mm-hmm. And what we need is to build on the lectern where he was giving this speech. It was a real signal speech. This was not some kind of offhand thing. It was a very determined intervention in build. And he outlined all kinds of areas of infrastructure and other things, industry to work on. And he said, if this reminds people of the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Right.
Now, this raised a lot of eyebrows because here's a conservative prime minister who's in the same party of Margaret Thatcher, who was, Madam Globalization, deregulation, Big Bang, putting City of London at the center of the casino.
Yeah.
So it's a big shift. Now, he represents the spirit that comes out of the Brexit vote.
Right.
That's how he got to the prime ministership. And the Brexit vote wasn't some kind of nerdy examination of all the accounts of the European Union and the British and this and that. It was simply the first time the general public had a chance to pull a lever to say, screw globalization.
Right.
Screw all of this deindustrialization, outsourcing, deregulation, and so forth.
Right.
So similarly, in the United States, a lot of people voted for Trump, not out of particular support for him. He was unproven in a certain way, and certainly he was, I view it favorably, but others could be unsettled. He's a wild man, It's delightful in a certain way. He's unpredictable, but people voted for him for the same reason people voted for the Brexit.
Right.
They finally had an opportunity to say, stop I'm getting off the good ship globalization. I'm getting off the good ship consensus of banker, financier government.
Well, and President Trump was willing to say things like audit the Fed, which are things we've heard through Ron Paul for many, many years. But, somehow when you hear Trump in his booming voice start to talk about these things, and we start to see results. Can you tell folks a little bit, because I know you've been following, what's going on with the Fed right now and the president? How is that relationship working or not working? And how does that play into, I feel like the Fed is not on Trump's side. And certainly we're seeing that conflict. So what can you tell us here about Trump's relationship with the Fed and how that's playing into this global coup?
I think that absolutely on the other side. There's, some people have put out, I think QAnon and some other people, some cock and bull story that somehow Trump had tamed the Federal Reserve. Nothing like that. The Federal Reserve is not a U.S. constitutional institution.
Right.
I think most people are listening have some inkling of that.
Right.
It is an extension of private banking cartels that are able to shape U.S. credit policy to feed the bubbles and the offshore hot money, nanosecond gambling games of the big financial operators at the expense of credit to our actual physical economy.
Well, and that's maybe, I'm sure many of the folks listening know, but it's always useful to inform the trolls so that they know as well. There are, I believe, five members of the Federal Reserve Board that are permanent because of their position as a specific bank president. So it is literally an organization built of banks by banks to control economic policy for the benefit of banks.
Absolutely, and it's not the ordinary bank. It's not your credit
Right.
union. It's not your community bank.
Right.
So it's a real problem. Now, the thing that's interesting about Boris Johnson's statement, and carry it forward to this judge, the British court that just fined Christopher Steele for lying and giving the president this handle to put the motion on the table, bring this guy back in and try him. The interesting thing here is that puts before Trump an option, and we're very strongly encouraging to take it. Go back to one of the hallmarks of the New Deal, and it was a bipartisan hallmark. This was not Democrat versus Republican, and that's Glass-Steagall.
Yes.
And I know, Suzzanne, you and I were just talking about this last week, and the importance of focusing on this.
So before we get into the Glass-Steagall, will you explain to people in layman's terms what is Glass-Steagall and what does it do for the economy, and what did getting rid of it do, and why do we need it back?
Glass-Steagall was passed in June of 1933, and what it did is it set up a firewall between commercial banks, which includes your community banks and other larger commercial banks, and the Wall Street-centered investment banking world, which issues stocks and bonds.
Right.
They had been the source of the huge rot that exploded, bringing on the Great Depression.
Sure.
And what they had done is they had taken savings from ordinary people's savings and put it into a gambling operation. And when the gambling collapsed, people had suddenly saw that their savings were gone.
Yes.
So Glass-Steagall sets a firewall where it basically says any obligations, debts, or whatever are incurred by the investment banking side is their lookout, but there's no way that the functioning of the commercial banks are going to be hostage to their losses.
Right.
So that means that the commercial banks, which actually have a very profound connection to the buildup of our country,
Sure.
you go back to what Alexander Hamilton did when he set up the national bank, and he set up a beautiful bank in New York before that. It was designed to channel people's savings and get those into the hands in the form of credit of the entrepreneurs who, in the most energetic way, were committed to building up new productive forces for the economy.
Right.
Whether that was improved agriculture, improved transportation, other forms of infrastructure, improved industry. How do you assemble and direct the credit to do that? And a commercial banking system which makes its money from the profitability of its investments, means that a sound banker is looking for exactly that kind of entrepreneur.
Correct.
And you want to nurture and protect that. Now, what's happened with Glass-Steagall being repealed in 1999, and by the way, Jamie Dimon had a lot to do with that, and he posed in front of the pistols that were used by Aaron Burr to kill Hamilton.
Right.
In 1804, when he boasted of having killed Glass-Steagall.
Symbolism will be their downfall, as we always say.
Exactly, you got it. They let the sow out. So anyway, once it was abolished, it accelerated something that had started when the dollar was taken off the gold reserve system by Nixon in 1971 under pressure of the British. We opened up the gates to fluctuating currency rates, interest rates. Volcker jacked up interest rates over 20% in the early 1980s. All kinds of the considerations that go into any sound, longer-term investment in any physical project. You're building a factory, it takes a couple of years. You're building a major infrastructure deal, it might take 10 years, like the interstate highways.
Sure.
You need to have knowable conditions of your financing.
Right.
Exactly. The minute you turn it into a wild, gyrating, unstable mass of speculation, you can't do that, and you tend to shorten the horizon of your investments so that more and more money is just chasing other money in games involving worldwide bets on currencies, interest rates, and so forth.
Well, yeah, and to put that, I think, in a layman's terms of understanding, if you're going to start a project, say like the Hoover Dam, something that takes many, many years to accomplish, you're going to need to know that the funding you're getting for those materials and equipment and labor that you're getting in the beginning is going to be at the same price or reasonably price measurable at the end of the process. If you have this fluctuating system, I can't tell you that what it's going to cost me to buy concrete in the beginning, that I'm even going to have that revenue available to me at the end. And so you don't start these big projects because you don't have the certainty to make sure that you can complete them. Is that kind of what you're trying to say?
That is very true. And if people look over the last 40 years, as Glass-Steagall was eroded and then eliminated, we also eroded and then eliminated any long-term infrastructure development in this country.
Well, and we, at the same time, did not maintain the infrastructure we had. Those two things go hand in hand. We've seen bridge collapses.
Exactly.
We've seen highway collapse. We've seen literally people losing their lives because we've let our infrastructure go past its lifespan as far as how long things can be built before we need to maintain them.
And as an aside, we also did the same process with our health system, so that the backup in terms of various kinds of things like the masks and the protective equipment and so forth, which we should have been stockpiling as just a normal precaution, we sold off on the grounds that it wasn't cost effective to have those stockpiles. Same thing with hospitals, where the privatization through HMOs and then handing it over to hedge funds on Wall Street. If you're maximizing profit, you don't want to have beds that are unused. You want to have full occupancy. So you cut the number of beds so you have full occupancy, but you can't respond to a surge situation.
Well, and I find it interesting that we're living in a world where the government gets more and more involved with our lives. But what you're actually explaining to me, because we're not preparing and using our strategic reserves, because we're not having the government have that backup role in life that it's had for many years, throughout much of modern American history, we can see the government playing that role for the overall well-being, but not necessarily being involved in your intimate everyday life. I feel like what you're explaining to me is that they're in my life in every possible way, but they're not there to protect me when everything goes badly because they've abdicated that responsibility as a nation.
That's a very powerful irony. I agree with that totally. The government needs to ensure that you have the conditions for the private initiatives of your entrepreneurs and others to function. You don't have the government actually directly supervise that. So I think that's a very, very well taken point. So what's happened is that in 2016, both the Republican and the Democratic Party platforms called for restoring Glass-Steagall. But the top people in both parties, as parties, the party, the rhinos and the rest of this, didn't want that at all. It was in there basically because a certain part of the base it was sort of the Bernie Sanders base on the Democratic side, and some people working with an anti-globalist base on the Republican side put it in. What Trump did, which is fascinating, and it has a lot of relevance to the current situation, is that in October of 2016, speaking to an audience of the Black community in North Carolina, he said, "I am looking very closely at restoring Glass-Steagall." And he put it in particular terms for that audience. He said, "Look, Black businesses need access to credit, and it's being choked off by the current system, which is, because so much is done to just prop up the casino." He didn't use those terms, but he was alluding to that phenomenon. He basically said, to get credit out to the real communities of the country and our real needs, we're going to have to bring back Glass-Steagall.
Well, and we've seen that actually in action. We've seen that over, the last multiple decades. We've seen organizations like the Small Business Administration claim they're helpful, but they've become less and less helpful. Less and less businesses are actually able to access those funds, and certainly during the shutdown, they've proved themselves to be pretty
Absolutely.
useless.
What a farce. What a farce. During the shutdown, the supposed help to get out to the more brick and mortar places, the mom and pop shops, etc., was coming out in thimblefuls, while the $450 billion in that initial CARES package back in March was put as a loss fund for the Federal Reserve to pump up a leverage of about 10 times more. So it was $4.5 trillion that the Federal Reserve could throw into backstopping bad bets on Wall Street.
Right.
So I think that is a good snapshot of what we've got just now. If the president were to pick up pick up a theme from what Boris Johnson just did, and say, look, we don't need a government to do things for you that a good, a private enterprise system can do on its own. But we have to get this global financial succubus off your back.
Yeah.
We've got to break the way that the financiers get trillions while you guys get a few, relatively paltry amounts to keep going. We need Glass-Steagall. We need a jobs program, but the jobs program should be tied to things like one of the signature issues that the president has beautifully brought back is our space program.
Sure.
Way undercovered by the media, which doesn't want people to have any positive idea of anything the president's doing.
Right.
And unfortunately, many Republicans are sort of playing games with sort of pre-existing issues and didn't really leap to attention when the president put something beautiful and new on the table, this Project Artemis.
Right.
To get our astronauts back to the moon by 2024, and a woman as well as a man, which is why it's called Artemis, the feminine, the goddess correlating to Apollo. It's beautiful. It's a lovely little idea. But then moving on to having some kind of permanent base of operation on the moon by 2028, and then from there moving on to Mars.
And Tim, not only did the Republicans not jump with enthusiasm when the president, in Kennedy-esque style, restore this enthusiasm for American exploration and for space experimentation and understanding the world we live in, but they balked at the same time when the president said our infrastructure is falling apart and we need to take this opportunity to fix the infrastructure. What we saw is a bunch of nervous Nellies up there in Washington who don't seem to be able to differentiate vital infrastructure spending from pork barrel projects that they send unnecessarily home to their district to win votes. They seem not to be able to understand the difference, and that as well, these infrastructure projects would be something that would be very beneficial to employment in this country, and certainly provide jobs that would help people out of this shutdown crises and get them back to work and back to a level of economic stability for their families.
Exactly. And what you and I were discussing with your listeners a couple of months ago is exactly relevant to the point you're making. Let's build a better economy than we had going into the shutdowns. And that means, especially among younger people, skills as a next generation of farmers, as a next generation of machinists. And what pours out of a space program are fundamental scientific advances, including the development of nuclear fusion energy. And so young people, whether they're directly participating in that or simply know somebody else who is or hear about it, they have a sense that the country is moving forward again, that we've got a future, that they've got a future.
So, Tim, I'm going to ask you this question real
sure.
quick now, because we've seen colleges, the president's been pushing back on this as well. We've seen universities suggest that they are not going to have in-person classes in the fall because of the coronavirus pandemic. I don't know about you, but I feel like science, engineering, mechanics, all of these things, these very tangible scientific fields, that's going to be hard to teach remotely. I feel like we need to be certainly educating, putting more people into these kind of fields. Where the universities are going are the direct opposite of that.
Well, I'll add one additional category to this, which is that space science has a tremendous relevance to defeating the coronavirus. It turns out that viruses have a reciprocal relationship to to fluctuations in the cosmic ray cycles.
Interesting.
Which have to do with all kinds of things in terms of where the Earth is inside where the solar system is inside the galaxy and so forth.
Right.
This has a lot more to do with so-called with climate change. I don't want to call it so-called because there obviously is climate change all the time. It's just not man-made in the way that these fanatics are screaming about.
Correct.
But viruses are a in-between category between life and non-life. We don't know nearly enough about them generally, but space science is one of the key avenues we want. And one of the things that I just found out about today, which is delightful, is that the South African-based huge, what they call a wide array radio telescope system that has the acronym of MeerKAT, which I love. That's so much fun. But this involves various radio telescopes in many countries, but they're the headquarters of it. They took their science and they put together a scientific team and they put together a way to develop a ventilator, not a ventilator, a ventilator that didn't involve intubation, didn't involve having to run the tube down, which is very invasive. I mean, I've had it done to me for other reasons, and it's just horrible.
Well, and we're seeing people who have had that. It has created complications with tissue damage in the throat cavity, and frankly, we've heard even the ventilators having too much pressure, and that also causing additional damage. So it's interesting that somebody is actually trying to innovate. You know, we were told, Cuomo basically let everybody know that everyone in New York was going to die if he didn't have 40,000 ventilators yesterday. So I find it interesting that nobody said, well, maybe we can find a better product for cheaper. Why are we dependent upon this one device that costs so much? Let's use innovation. Let's use people's ability to come up with new and exciting ideas. It's one of the great gifts of humanity. Let's use that to create a product that's going to be more affordable and easier to maintain and better for the patient. So I find it interesting that you're talking about that right now.
Absolutely. And so this is a beautiful example of how you can harness these things together. So this space program exemplifies, and it's the fourth law of what Lyndon LaRouche, back around 6 years ago, a few years before he died, had put forward. These aren't laws. We discussed them. They're not laws in the sense that they're particularly written up to be enacted as specific legislation, though they involve legislation. But they're four principles, and the first is restoring Glass-Steagall. The second is some kind of national credit institution, whether it's a national infrastructure bank or it's just a renewed Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or it's what Lincoln did with greenbacks. There are various ways to do this. But you direct credit into those areas that are most productive, that need to be built up. The private sector development, but you ensure the government ensures enough of the funding for that outside of the criteria that Wall Street and London operate. That's the real tussle there. The third part that LaRouche emphasizes is use the most productive technologies. If you're going to rebuild a rail system, rebuild it with high-speed rail or magnetic levitation or whatever, as an example. And then fourthly, you need science drivers, which become the seedbed for new broad platforms of technological capabilities that have applications that you may not even dream of today. And they flow once you have mastered it. Nuclear fusion involves plasmas. 98% of the material in the universe is plasma. If we come to understand it much better, it's what the sun is. It's a gigantic ball of plasma. It's a gigantic fusion energy reactor. If we are able to get mastery of these characteristics of the universe, this transforms everything. Everything that was involved in this insane statement that Biden made, I believe yesterday, about we in the Democratic Party have $2 trillion of an infrastructure program. We're going to have only electric vehicles by 2035, and we're going to eliminate this and we're going to eliminate that. Pure Green Deal genocide stuff. Contrast that with what LaRouche has put forward in those four elements that combined really put enormous rates of development of scientific technological progress with the credit system that's required for it. That's the package that we're saying the president can outflank all of this this playbook that the Democrats and the British
Well,
intelligence,
it's very interesting that you mentioned you mentioned Joe Biden's statement there, because it goes right along with the standard Democrat modus operandi, which is they are trying to achieve an outcome, not equality of opportunity, not taking advantage of the innovation and entrepreneurship and just adaptivity of the American mind and the American worker, but they're trying to create an outcome. We have to have only electric cars. We have to create these lockstep results. And by doing that, they're actually shackling the capacity to make that kind of innovation, the capacity to actually find the ticket out of these cycles of waste and environmental struggle we're having. We certainly always want to have better technology, but if you're looking for a specific outcome, like the electric car, for example, I think that's a perfect example. We've thrown all of our eggs in this electric car basket. Well, for all we know, somebody's got that magical car that runs on water somewhere in a blueprint. We just haven't manifested that because that individual hasn't had the same access to these funded companies like Solyndra and other corporations that we know got green money handouts from Democrat candidates, from Democrat senators and congressmen, and subsidies is the word I'm looking for, in the past. So it's funny, we see the Democrats doing the same thing and causing the same result. We've suppressed the capacity of the American people to make a better future for themselves by demanding a certain outcome. And I know that's one of the reasons we elected President Trump, is that he has great faith in the American people and their ingenuity, and certainly wants to release that as opposed to suppress it and control it.
And in fact, the final paragraph, or one of the final parts of his magnificent speech at Mount Rushmore, touched exactly that theme. He's come to it a number of times, but this was one of the finest statements of exactly that thought. Now, what I wanted to throw out is something that may challenge some of the people listening to us, Suzzanne.
Sure.
But there is an international component of this, because we cannot really throw off the shackles of this globalist financial succubus by ourselves, even though we're the most powerful nation on the globe. But there's
in the same way that we could not end the shutdown of the globe ourselves, merely by the United States not shutting down, we would not have stopped that plan.
Exactly, and because the pools of coronavirus and other diseases in places like Africa, which have been stripped of development by the international bankers for forever, before and after the decolonization, these things become petri dishes. Obviously, huge rates of death in those areas. There's a famine that's been developing now because of locusts, worse in 60 years in East Africa. No one's talking about it. Here's Black Lives Matter screaming about things in the United States. Some of them, are obvious injustices. A lot of it just artificially cranked up. And
at the same time, we see Africa being used as an experimental location for vaccines with very dangerous and sad results. We already have a resistance to some of these top-down outsiders coming in and trying to push a vaccine on people in the African continent, because they have seen the result of that. So they've been used as guinea pigs as well as a petri dish.
That's very true. So what we're looking at here is how are we going to pull together enough of the strategic and population dense nations working together to get out of the yoke of the London, Wall Street centered globalist financial system, and put things on a sort of global American system basis.
Sure.
Because it's a matter of justice, but it also involves our ability to get a lot of our industry back on its feet, supplying much of the rest of the world with the sanitation systems and the satellites and all kinds of other things that are needed.
Right.
So this is where something that President Putin in Russia had proposed at the beginning of the year, parallel to what Helga LaRouche had called for. Helga LaRouche had called for a summit involving Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping, and Modi, of the Prime Minister of India.
Right.
Because those four countries all have elements in their histories of confronting colonialism confronting the British Empire or the French
Correct.
Empire or whatever.
Correct.
We obviously have the greatest tradition in the world in terms of
Right.
confronting the British Empire.
Certainly.
But China has a lot because of the Opium Wars and the related destruction of China.
Oh yeah, and India very much so as well, deeply
India
affected
very
by
much so,
English
and
colonialism.
Russia has a tradition here that can kick in. Now, this is outside of the particulars of the current relations or the current leaders, though it's interesting. The current leaders are strong leaders who tend to work well when they get out of the grip of their own policy bureaucracies.
Yeah.
Yeah, in all countries, but we're the worst right now, and anyone can see it in terms of the of scurrilous characters like Pompeo,
Sure.
who, and this is relevant to the Binney material. President Trump got wind that Binney had proof that the whole Russiagate thing was a fraud.
Mhm.
Not that the collusion charge was fraudulent, but the actual underlying charge that the Russians had interfered with our elections by
Correct.
hacking these computers was a fraud.
Right. Correct.
So President Trump asked Binney to go over and talk to Pompeo, who in the fall of 2017 was head of the CIA.
Yeah.
And to his absolute shame, Pompeo listened for an hour.
Mhm.
He didn't order a follow-up. He didn't order a panel to convene to evaluate it. I'm not saying that Pompeo should have said, I agree with you completely and
Sure.
you're great and everybody else was wrong,
Right.
but rather, this is substantive. You know what you're talking about. Let's get in a panel to evaluate it. Instead, he sent Binney out the door, said, you'll hear from me. He never did.
Right.
He never contacted Binney.
Right. Don't
The
call
next
us.
week,
We'll call you.
The
Yeah.
next week, he endorsed the Obama Committee of Intelligence Committee, which had said it was the Russians.
Yeah.
Pompeo, and this set the president up for another 2 years of
Mhm.
this abuse and all of this.
Mhm.
Now, I mention that just because, you know, a lot of things where Trump has been trying to reduce our troop deployments, get out of these endless wars and so forth, Pompeo has been tending to accelerate and intensify the conflicts.
Well, and we
in
saw
ways
the
that are
same thing
undercutting
with
the president.
Bolton as well.
Exactly.
We've seen that
Bolton
breaking
and
apart with
Pompeo are really
Mattis. Even yes, we've seen.
You got it. They're cut from the same cloth.
Yeah.
So anyway, here Putin followed up what Helga had said in his own way. At the end of January, he said, look, this is the 75th anniversary year of the end of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
We face a danger of fascism again in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And he was referring basically to the globalist depredations.
Yeah.
And what he said, because he wasn't referring to Trump, he wasn't referring, I mean, he and Trump get along when they get
Right.
together. So what he said is, let's get the permanent 5 members of the Security Council
Mm-hmm.
set up after World War II in the UN to be a certain kind of core of the nations that defeated the fascism in Europe and the militarism in Japan.
Right.
And they're going to be outside of just sort of mass votes in General Assembly of the UN. They're going to be able to protect their interests, but they're going to be a guiding anchor to the post-war system.
Yeah.
So he said, let's 75 years later, let's get those 5 countries together again.
Well, and I think
Because
it's
we're in
interesting
a-
that you mentioned that, because what, anybody who follows what the UN has been doing, back when I was younger, we'd constantly see votes being held by the UN, and we would be talking about those permanent members, and China was going to veto or Russia was going to veto, and it wasn't going to get through because one of the permanent members wasn't going to. We saw a lot more of those permanent members really engaging in the direction of the UN. But I got to say, in the last decade, the UN has seemed to take its own direction. That we're so much more talking now about the World Bank, the World Court, the World Health Organization. We're talking about these agencies within the UN, and certainly less and less talking about those 5 permanent members having any sort of real control or direction of the UN activities. And I think that you're speaking directly to that loss of those permanent members being such an integral part of what the UN is doing has certainly led to a massive abuse at the United Nations as far as implementing globalism, and certainly taking a partisan agenda on a variety of issues, including Israel.
The area that I think is most striking along the lines of what you're saying is what the UN has done on the green. The Green New Deal is part of it, but the whole man-made global warming hoax has been under UN aegis. That's
right.
where these international panels of climate change, whatever, IPCC thing, all these Paris Accords, that's all under a UN umbrella.
Right.
And it's hideous.
Yeah.
So the point about the idea of the P5, Permanent 5 meeting, is not so much in relation to the structure of the UN as it simply becomes a pre-existing framework to address today how we get out of what is an increasing level of deterioration of the strategic relations. How are we, it isn't a question of just putting in or having new arms control agreements. Get out of the need, get out of the conflicts that are precipitating these tensions. And
right.
the fact that Russia has a strong space program. China has a strong space program. India has a very remarkable program.
Yeah.
Even though they had a lander on near the south pole of the moon that failed in the very last moments of its landing, it was a tremendous achievement to have gotten that far.
Right.
And the entire nation of India was enthralled by the project, and the young people of India particularly.
Right.
We have a revived space direction. So what a beautiful thing if you have a P5 summit that also includes a ratification of cooperation on space work.
Right.
What if you have a P5 ratification of the principle of Glass-Steagall? Right now, China is the only nation that still has that in effect. If we went back in that direction, we would be saying we want to have credit institutions that can collaborate, for instance, on bringing sanitation and nuclear power and major further development in places of Africa, so that all of mankind is essentially free of having the drag of part of mankind being in conditions of such misery, such breakdown. And Africa, by the way, there's so much. We had a woman from Burkina Faso on one of our international Schiller Institute conferences just 2 months ago, who had just gotten a degree in space science.
Nice.
And she was a black woman, young woman, encouraging young women studying in Africa to jump in on this.
Right.
So this is not just throwing something in there. This is working on developing the productive powers of all the nations as sovereign nations.
Right.
But if you're going to break the way that the globalists operate through the global financial institutions especially, you've really got to have the weight of U.S., Russia, and China on the same side of that.
Right.
And what we're calling for is to have a P5 zone, which is increasingly likely under Trump's instructions. Pompeo broke his profile and had a productive meeting with Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, about 2 days ago, and they came out saying we were discussing what we want to put into the P5 meeting.
Great.
So what we're calling for the president to do is basically between now and such a meeting in September, which is not guaranteed but looks increasingly likely.
Right.
Make a turn in the direction of what Boris Johnson has outlined for Britain. Build. Franklin Roosevelt style big projects with some kind of funding and mechanism, along with Glass-Steagall, but not the government actually carrying out the projects.
Right.
These are going to be contracted to private agencies.
Sure.
But set the direction for that.
Right.
And simultaneously work toward this P5 thing so that we get a certain framework of people feeling that humanity has a means to confront things, including disease, including famine. Our farm sector is absolutely devastated right now by the low prices to farmers. The cartels are increasingly, monstrously grabbing the middleman inflated prices. And this is true in other countries as well. This is a major area we've got to look at.
Well, and we've seen, even in our own country, our regulatory process that we put on our grocery stores and our food industry have led to a situation where our grocery stores are basically importing a lot of our produce from places like Chile and South America. And I'm all for trade. But when we literally have food rotting on the vine here in the United States, that food hasn't able to go to the grocery store because of the regulations, because of the processing rules. So certainly we've seen some of what globalizing too much can really do to a country. And we certainly don't want to be isolationist, but we want that flexibility of our economy. We want that ability for people here in the United States to innovate. We want to be able to access our resources and use them here and trade them around the world. We certainly don't want to get ourselves locked into a situation where our only supply of grapes comes from Chile, even though we have grapes growing in California that we can't eat because they can't get through the process. So we certainly have a lot of work to do in this managing the globalist regulatory structure and returning that to a structure that, I think you and I agree is more productive for the individual, more productive for the entrepreneur, and then thusly more productive for society as a whole.
Absolutely. And I think Alexander Hamilton is smiling wherever he is listening to what you just
Wonderful.
said. Because now, one last thing I want to bring up, because it also exemplifies the president's ability when he deals one-on-one with other heads of state to be able to get out of the grip of the mice, out of the grip of the bureaucracies, which are so infused with all of the last 50 years deterioration. And that was his summit with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the Mexican president, AMLO, last week. This was singular. This defied all ordinary calculus of political or ideological leanings and so forth. Here's López Obrador, a leftist, comes out of a nationalist tradition in Mexico, and you have Trump, a nationalist tradition in the United States. And nominally, because of frictions on the border and all the rest of it, it was sort of a done deal in terms of the liberals on both sides of the border to say these guys are going to be like tearing each other apart like cats and dogs, right? But they have a sense of statecraft and a sense of their own nation's histories that we in the LaRouche movement have put on the table in a way that helps shape the really beautiful outcome of the talks between López Obrador and Trump. Back in 1982, Lyndon LaRouche had a historic meeting with the then president of Mexico, Jose López Portillo. And at the time, Mexico was being hit with wild currency warfare led by London and Wall Street, where the Mexican peso was being torn apart. Flight capital, everybody who could move money out of the country was doing it. The country was just teetering. And so LaRouche said, you've got to go, and LaRouche called it Operation Juarez, named for Benito Juarez, the Mexican president in the early 1860s, who sustained and defended the sovereignty of Mexico against the invasion of the French with Maximilian, the Habsburg, and a Habsburg prince installed as an emperor of Mexico. Lincoln and Juarez never met personally, but their emissaries met, and both of them were acutely aware of just how profound and important the struggle was to maintain and defend the republics on both sides of the border. That was an alliance. That was a powerful alliance of principle, and it was reproduced in the 1930s when President Lázaro Cárdenas of Mexico and President Franklin Roosevelt here were facing what to do in terms of the common depression. They knew that the Axis powers were getting involved in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the Nazis, and they forged a very productive relationship. Those two singular moments of cooperation at a high level between the two nations were invoked explicitly and repeatedly by Trump and López Obrador. They jointly laid wreaths at the monument to Benito Juarez and to Lincoln. And they spoke about this in very feeling terms. And once you have that as your mental framework, then you had those expressions of very strong mutual respect. This absolutely floored the pundits and the Democrats and et cetera. And it was just a very extraordinary statement at a level of the institution of the presidencies of these two republics. Now, if we bring that quality to bear through a P5 meeting, through other modalities, remember, both, and this is interesting, most people don't know this, both the Chinese and the Russians have made a very clear distinction between certain U.S. policies, as previously indicated by Bolton and now by Pompeo and by Navarro and others, and what the president represents, what Trump represents. And Trump came in, as people will remember, with a very strong commitment to improving relations with Russia and China in particular. A lot of that has eroded, but nevertheless, the sentiment, that's the wrong word, the recognition that if we can find common ground in certain areas, not all of them, but enough in the terms of space, for instance, in terms of fighting disease, in terms of other things, then we have a basis to break clear of the entire globalist financial noose
Yes.
that we're all in.
Well, and I think the critical word on that, and we've gone over 15 minutes, Tim. We can't stop. We just talk too much. But I think the critical word that you put in there is finding common ground rather than forcing common ground. And what we've seen with this globalist ideology is that they come in with what they have decided is common ground, and we all have to just agree with their common ground. And if we don't, we're killing the planet or grandma or whoever we're racist against, or we're putting up statues that are killing people, whatever we're doing. We're the problem if we don't agree with their common ground. But what you're talking about is an organic process by which human individuals in different nations coming up through different societies actually find common ground where we can benefit one another, our nation and their nation working hand in hand, benefiting both our people and their people mutually. That's where that works. It never works the other way when you're forcing that common ground on people, because of course that's not common ground. Common ground is literally
that is the globalist financier dictatorship that calls itself that common ground. It's not. It's a graveyard.
Certainly, and I would argue that it is an anti-human way of thinking. When we find common ground, we're finding that as fellow human beings, and when we're forcing an idea and an ideology on people, regardless of human reaction, regardless of human need, regardless of just basic human operating standards. We all want food for our families. We all want a roof over our head. We like to think that the next generation is going to do better than this generation. We want better for our children than we want for ourselves. That's ubiquitous throughout humanity, regardless of what country you come from, what skin color you are, or what language you speak. So when we find that human bond, we've moved globally forward. And when we have forced an ideology in contrast to that natural human bond, we've seen massive devastation, genocide, and the destruction of human civilization as we know it again and again, only to be rebuilt when people once again realize that we have to go back to finding common ground. So,
it's a beautiful summation. I agree totally. I would just add one thing: expect surprises. People shouldn't feel under it just because clearly the economic situation is going to be worsening as we run out of the temporary, forbearance on paying various rents and things like that. And the school situation is going to be just very tough, whatever is going on. It's just a very hard situation to work through. Right. The point on it is that that's a given. The freedom of action along the lines of some kind of FDR package in the way that Boris Johnson just put it forward for Trump to do that. The freedom of action to work at the president levels of the great nations, much as it was in a microcosm shown again with this Lopez Obrador Trump business. This is something that the president backed up and in a certain way encouraged by his own movement. Right. This is where you can take command of the situation, not be a prisoner of whether or not the Dudleys of the world and the Federal Reserve pull the plug on the Wall Street bubble just before the election. Don't sit around worrying about that. Let's assume that they're planning to do that and that they'll try. But if the country already knows that we have an actual economic American system resurgence that's defined, we will go through that and come through, with Trump reelected and moving in that direction and be strengthened because he brought it up as part of getting reelected.
Well, and I think we have a lot of work to do on that tip, both in getting the president reelected. It's going to be our responsibility to make sure those votes show up at the polls, and we're going to make sure that happens. But I think also the American people have a duty right now to get into their local governments, get into their state governments, and start pushing back against these inhibitive measures that we're seeing against business, so that as the president is moving forward and certainly working in these global ways, with the USMCA, with other mechanisms, other policies that he is going to be implementing as we're going forward, which will strengthen the American people and our ability to surge from this shutdown. We've got to get in and get those Democrat governors, those Democrat mayors back in line. That's going to be one of the jobs we have as citizens. And certainly I think the president has been very clear in his support of federalism, of supporting the fact that states have rights. And even if the state is doing something dumb, they have the right to do that.
And let me add a little footnote, and I know you have to wind up now, but people should not have some sort of blanket view of China, Russia, other nations. There's a lot of complex things going on in all these places. And just as a beautiful little example of that, the head of our EIR is the LaRouche Movement's World News Service. We've had it up for 45 years, Executive Intelligence Review. Our Washington correspondent wrote a column which was published in the Chinese CGTN news service, which is one of the major Chinese news services. And the subject of it was the importance of what President Trump did in commuting Roger Stone's infamous show trial, and the correlated importance of exonerating Lyndon LaRouche from his similar show trial back in the 1980s with Robert Mueller in the middle of it. But this was published in a very prominent place in China. So you begin to get an idea that thinking elements of the policy structures, are much more alive and are actually much more favorable to the kind of thing that Trump has been trying to do than what certain press in both sides, U.S. and in China, have been trying to do. We've got to nurture these. It's very. When you have figures of the nature of a Stone or a LaRouche or whatever, who are free agents, they're not prisoners of these rotten political party systems and so forth. And you suddenly get that bursting out in a very public and prominent place in China right now. This exemplifies that you should expect the unexpected, and we can't get locked into the ebbs and flows of sudden media spasms and other things that can include stuff on Fox as well as anywhere else. I mean, people should recognize we're not dealing with straight shooters.
No, and none of the journalists at all. And certainly that's one of the things that people.
So we really need the principles. We need the principles. There's 4 laws of LaRouche, starting with Glass-Steagall, culminating in great science projects like the Moonshot program, revived with fusion energy rockets and things. Boy, you can sweep up young people. You can take people who are not Trump lovers, but are going to say, that's a future I like. And I certainly aren't going to get it with Biden. So this is the way that we've got to be able to shift the dynamics and have things that we seize and put forward, rather than simply, afraid that the enemy's game plan is just going to, take everyone out to sea.
Well, and certainly I think they'd love to do that. But, if you look at the polls, if you look at the progress the president has made in a variety of demographics and a variety of battleground states, we have a good chance to do very well. And I think what's going to be important to see people
forget polls.
Yeah, I'm saying we've seen in the past, not even so much the presidential polls, but certainly job approval ratings. We've seen some very positive things that, get through the media dragnet, if you will, of anything positive. They can't let anything positive get through about the president. But we still are seeing those things. We still are seeing that the president does very well in demographics that the left does not want him doing well in. Certainly, there's a lot less anger and resistance as far as what the president, as far as what the media says the people have towards the president versus what people are actually saying about the president. And we see that in the results of his events. We see that in the Goya boycott, for example. Here we see a leftist trying to push back against the Goya company because the president of the company spoke positively about President Trump. And what happened? Well, the shelves at the grocery store are empty of Goya, but they're certainly not empty of Goya because people were angry. They all got bought up. So, we're seeing a lot of indications that the support for this president is very strong. And certainly what we're going to need to do over the next few months is make sure that as many people that agree with us and want to continue this progress for our nation, not progressivism, but progress for our nation, back from the brink of socialism/communism, back to the American way of doing things, American capitalism and American prosperity. We've got some work to do, but I think we're going to accomplish that if we just make sure each and every one of us goes out there, find, as I say, Tim, and I'm going to tell you to do it too, find 5 friends that might not vote otherwise and encourage them and get them out to vote. If each and every one of us just encourages a few more people who might not have made it to the polls to get out there and vote for the president, we will more than make up for any of the fraud that we're going to see the Democrats attempt. So you go find some people, and everybody listening, go find their people. Let's make sure we get those votes to the polls for the president so that we can continue getting this country back on track, and certainly giving to our children the legacy of liberty and prosperity that our parents handed to us.
Yep. And let me give a little plug while we're getting off to our website. I encourage people strongly to get to www.larouchepac.com.
Yeah.
LaRouche is LaRouchePAC.com. We have a morning 10-minute video update from one of our senior people, Harley Schlanger, who many of you may have heard on radio shows around. Every morning, Monday through Friday, that 10 minutes is just precious.
Yeah.
So wonderful. I would really urge people to sample that. Tomorrow would be a good time if you can do it. And just generally use our website as much as you can.
Well, and certainly I would encourage folks as well, because I think that one of the values that you LaRouchians are bringing to the political table right now is certainly a lot of history and understanding of how things have gone in the past, and how that is we're just repeating many of those things right now, but certainly also, and I would encourage my listeners to go and take a look at it, challenging our one-size-fits-all opinions of nations like Russia, China, India, etc., challenging our ideas of how we're going to relate to those countries as a nation. I think you guys are doing a really good job on that, and I encourage you to keep putting that kind of complexity into the mind of the voters, because it's certainly, foreign policy is not black or white. It is a nuanced art, and that's why we hired someone who understands the art of the deal. Yeah,
very good. Okay, Suzzanne.
Tim, thank you so much for coming in. Everyone is always so overwhelmed. They love you. They think we should have our own show somewhere. And there many thanks from the folks listening in. So thank you once again for yet another great discussion. And I'm sure we'll have many more in the next several months going forward, because, the battle isn't going to stop at Election Day. We're certainly going to need to keep fighting and supporting the president and making the right decision. And you're very right to encourage us to do that. So thank you again, Tim, for stopping in.
Thank you, and delighted to be in touch with all of the people listening.
We'll see you again next time.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
So everyone, that was Tim Rush. As you know, we love bringing him on. He certainly provides a lot of texture, a lot of context to these ideas that the media loves to simplify. It loves to make it black or white. Hate it or love it, swipe left, swipe right. This is the world we're living in, but that's not reality. Reality is, geopolitical complexities, and certainly understanding history as it relates to our current situation. So I'm really glad we got Tim to come on and have him as a resource again and again. So thank you all for tuning in. We will be back again on Friday. I want to just let you guys know I'm going to be starting a new show on Tech TV Network, Internet Network, starting possibly Thursday, if not Tuesday. They're in the process of putting up their new servers, so we're going to find out about that. But I will be doing Tuesdays and Thursday shows, 8 p.m. on the Tech TV Network. I'm going to share that information here with you so you can tune into that as well. We're spreading the message out. It's going to be exciting. So thank you guys for tuning in. We'll be back on Friday. Until next time, until then, love y'all. This is your girl, Suzzanne Monk. Trumping out.